What are barriers to verbal communication? We're going to focus on verbal aggression, deception, defensiveness, and communication apprehension. So verbal aggression would relate to attacks on self-concept rather than position. So if they're going to try to go for some aspect of the person they're speaking with rather than what they're saying. So characteristics, how you look, and this is, I hear this a lot with children, but I've also heard this in politics. So these kinds of elements show up where we're talking about a characteristic of a person rather than what they're stating. And in fair argumentation, I'd say you should probably make sure that you're discussing information based on characteristics of the people that based on what they're saying rather than the characteristics of them. And sometimes this will show up as a temporary mental state. So if someone's tired or frustrated or angry, this all kind of can come to head and the person's more likely to be verbally aggressive. I know that for me, I ran into this a lot in the call center. At some point in life, people found it effective to be aggressive or rude to the people that they were talking to on the phone, I guess because the squeaky wheel gets greased. But in my case, you're more likely to get more from honey than vinegar. So I wasn't really always going to give anything more to somebody that was rude to me. If they were kind to me, I was much more likely to bend over backwards to try to be supportive and helpful to them. I'm not going to lie, I have resorted to verbal aggression, excuse me, when I've spoken to someone on the phone before. So I have been known to use this technique as well. So certainly if you have like a short-term goal, like you're just trying to get something taken care of or handled, you might be a little bit more likely to go into this. Now, if you're on the other end and you're dealing with somebody that you know is verbally aggressive, it might be just their normal pattern. So it might not be situational. This is how they deal with everything. So obviously you avoid triggers. So if you're not going to tease them or cause them to feel uncomfortable. You're not going to do anything to create the situation. And then if you can, you're going to minimize contact. Do what you can to sort of avoid the situation where you might be put in verbal aggression. I don't know about other people. I don't enjoy it. I know that sometimes I've been working with people on the phone again, and they were deliberately trying to get the person on the other end to argue with them. And it's really hard to have an argument with somebody if they're not choosing to participate in the argument. So you almost need two to tango here when it comes to argumentation and verbal aggression. If you don't choose to participate, they're not going to get much out of that. So be polite and respectful. Give them an opportunity to speak. Stay calm and show empathy. Avoid retaliation and decline to continue. So if this isn't a comfortable situation for you, then you can say, hey, just hold on a second, and I don't choose to participate, so I'm going to step away right now. The next one we're going to go focus on is deception. So deliberately being uninformative, vague, or misleading. And the biggest type of this is going to be around concealment. So leaving out important information. It kind of exploits the other person's belief because they're making the assumption that you're giving truthful information. So you really want to be cognizant of making this decision to conceal information. They're like, well, I didn't lie, but you also didn't necessarily tell the full truth. So that's a challenge. Sometimes I think there's an element of this in being careful on how you're saying things. So that might be concealment in a way, but another way, sometimes we have to be careful about how we're referring to terminology, how we're talking about language, how we're working with people. So concealment is really a form of deception. It's considered to be unethical. And Also, along with that, the idea that it is disrespectful. If we're not giving full information, we're trying to trick somebody else into an idea or belief, and um, that's unethical and disrespectful. So another thing is it's impractical to deceive. If you're telling a lie, oftentimes that lie leads to another lie. And then you have to keep track of all the lies. So that's a whole bunch more work to have to keep worrying about keeping track of all the lies you told. So this becomes a little bit more challenging as well. And then it can be destructive. So that can have long-term consequences in relationships if you're not careful about how communication happens with people over time. There is also defensive communication. And this is when you might be giving somebody some feedback, and there's going to be impolite responses to feedback. There is an element of how the information is being delivered, who's delivering the information, the context the information is being delivered in. Is this being done in front of a lot of other people, or is this being done quietly on the backside? How is this information being delivered? As a teacher that teaches public speaking, this is an interesting challenge. I do give feedback in class, and I do allow the other students to give feedback as well in class. And I remember having one student, and I normally don't have to say, when you give feedback, you need to make sure you're giving positive and negative feedback, until I had a student that didn't have any concept about how giving feedback, and would get up and he would just give negative feedback to everybody and only focus on what they did wrong instead of focusing on what they did right as well. And it became interesting when that student got up to give speeches, how the other students literally attacked that person. So really, being careful about how you're doing something like that. As a teacher, I have to create an environment that allows this to happen in a way that doesn't cause upset or anger with the other people that are participating in the communication. So there's a lot of elements that go into how you make this work. And I can't say that I necessarily have always done it effectively or as effectively as I might, but I think it is important to make sure that you're being good about how you're communicating, the information. And if I'm coming at this from a teacher point of view, I'm going to get a little bit more play in this because I've been given permission based on the situation or context. But sometimes, I can tell students aren't listening to what I have to say. It's like I'm being dismissed. Like, clearly I don't know what I'm talking about. And it's a person's choice. They don't have to take the feedback that I offer. And certainly you don't have to take the feedback somebody else offers. I think the smart thing to do when someone gives you feedback is to listen to it and decide if it seems truthful to you. There's been feedback I've received, and it's like, this doesn't even make sense to me. It doesn't fit with anything else that I've been told in the past. And it doesn't seem to fit in this context or this situation. So I have been in situations where I have not taken or accepted feedback because it didn't make sense. It didn't seem valid. But I think that anytime information comes into you from the outside world, I think it's a good idea to look at it and decide its validity based on, the context, the situation, if there's an opportunity for you to make improvement based on the information that's been given to you. And, if a person's interpersonally competent, they're able to sort of assimilate the information, and by not acknowledging it, it does violate norms, and it does come across as being disrespectful. So there's different types of being defensive. There's this idea of being dogmatic, and it's just dismissing a person's suggestions for improvements, refusing to consider other people's viewpoints, considering to say, nope, my behavior is acceptable. this could come about just because of people's previous experience. I mean, someone may have attacked them in the past, and this was a kind of a protection thing that they put up to sort of keep themselves safe. So you really need to be careful sometimes when giving feedback, just to make sure that you're setting things up in a way that makes it easier for someone to hear what you have to say. If a person responds with superiority, suggesting that they have special status or knowledge, you know, that's that's another way to sort of deflect communication that might come to you. Then there's this idea of indifference, like, well, that's nice. Your information's irrelevant and important to me. Thanks for sharing. Well, they may not heard what you had to say, but you're at least, if you provide the information and you do it on your side in the most kind way, then that's going to be helpful. But know that sometimes people may respond to you with this idea of indifference, like your information's irrelevant to them. And then control. So a person might try to take control of a situation and try to keep that communication from happening or try to attack back. So you might have those elements show up when somebody is communicating and creating a defensive communication response to your feedback. So things that you want to do is to control factors that you think might trigger. So again, kind of come about things in a kind way, recognize both strengths and opportunities. So recognize something they did well. Oftentimes they talk about the Oreo cookie method, like give them something good, give them some suggestions on something they might improve on and go back to something good. So I'm always trying to find something right that somebody did and what they covered, as well as things that they might improve on, because I think you need to recognize both. I think it's important anyway. Oh, obviously we can avoid it. As a teacher, I can't do that, but I might be able to restructure the encounter, so maybe make shifts to it in order to allow it to come out in a more positive way. And then, as we just mentioned with the we and I language, use elements like that, like I'm taking control of my own experience and my own emotion about how this came across to me, but I wanted you to know that this is my experience of what I noticed or I saw in the communication or the situation. A person can also respond to you with communication apprehension or fear. And, things have happened to people in their lives that have caused them to be more sensitive to communication situations, interactions where things didn't go well for them. And they may have a lot of fear about what that might look like, or if they just really haven't had that much experience. They may not necessarily approach this with a great deal of skill. So things that you might look at would be mental maps. So planning actions. What might you do if when you're going to go into a situation? Maybe how might you approach it? I've thought oftentimes when I'm going through something, I figure out how I'm going to communicate it. What's going to be the best and most powerful way for me to say something, so that somebody might be able to hear what I have to say. And then maybe figure out what you might say if the partner responds back in a specific way. So if they say this, then this is how I might handle it. Or if they say that, this is how I might approach it. So kind of coming up with that. I think you need to be careful about getting too much into your head about the communication, because sometimes it goes totally different than you might expect. But at least going in with the first few things that you might say in a communication situation can be helpful. Maybe planning out some questions that you might ask, or ideas or concepts that might be communicative that you might both share, that you can bring up in those kinds of situations. So, communication apprehension doesn't have to just be in a conflict situation. It can just be in communicating with another person, just because you're not used to it. So what might that look like? All right, I hope that's helpful. Thanks.